Hey guys, welcome back to the Cinema 4D tutorial series on constraints. In this part, we're going to continue on from where we left off in the previous video, which was with this little railing system here that we put together. And what we're going to be doing in this part is attaching a hose that's going to be dynamic to these little round loop hooks that we put onto the rail. So let's get started by drawing out the spline that we're going to use for the hose. So I'm going to use a B-spline for this, and the reason why I'm going to use a B-spline is because this hose is going to be dynamic, and if we were to choose something like a Bezier spline, those little interpolation handles on the Bezier spline are not going to adapt themselves to the movement of the hose, and what we're going to end up with is some kinking and some bulges in the hose, and that's just not going to look right. Alright, so we'll start by grabbing the pen tool and make sure you have B-spline as the selected type. And you might be thinking that we can just draw out a really quick spline by making a little zigzag pattern with one point at the top and one at the bottom. And we can just move these points into place to make it look like the spline is going through the center of those loop hooks. But unfortunately, this method is not going to work because there's not enough points. So let me explain what I mean here. So let me just quickly set this up inside of a sweep NURB. So we'll grab a circle spline, we'll drop that in. That's obviously too big, so we'll pull that down a little bit. And that is way too many segments. So I'm going to take the circle spline and change the intermediate points mode over to uniform. Just bring that down to about 3. And we'll go to the spline. We'll change that over to uniform as well. And we'll increase the subdivision count here to about 40. Now the way that we're going to be able to control this hose is through the use of the points constraint. So with the spline selected, I'm going to hit Control A to select all the points, and then we're just going to call up the command for the CD add points constraint, and that's going to give us null objects now that we can animate. So what we're basically going to do is take these null objects up here at the top, and we're going to place them as children of each one of these little loop hooks on the rail. Now if your railing system doesn't have any turns in it, because you can see that mine has 2 turns here, it's got this first corner and then the second one. If you don't have any bends or turns in your railing system, then this particular setup here, the way we have it rigged with this B-spline, that should work just fine. There shouldn't be any problem with it. But if your railing system has some corners, this method is not going to work. So let's pretend for just a moment that all of these null objects are in the correct place in the hierarchy and everything is set up and ready to go. So remember that when these little loop hooks get down here to the corners, you can see that they're rotating as they make their way around that corner. And if those null objects that are controlling the spline are attached as children, then that means that those null objects are also going to rotate. But the problem is that just because you rotate the point, that doesn't mean that the spline is also going to rotate. So if we were to select one of these points up here, or one of these nulls that's controlling the point, we'll select this one. And if we go to the coordinates tab, and if we try to rotate this, watch what happens. Nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. So that means that this hose is not going to rotate and stay inside of that little loop on that hook. So that's going to cause a problem. It's not going to look very real as that hose makes its way around the corner. So this particular method is not going to work for our railing system. And the reason why is because we need more points. So we'll go back to a side view, and what I'm going to do is just delete all of these target nulls, and we'll delete the spline, but I'm going to hang on to the sweep NURB because we're just going to reuse all of that once we create the new spline. So we'll go back to the pen tool, make sure we're using B-spline again, and what I want to do is create 2 points at the top and then 2 points down at the bottom where it's hanging. So we'll start about here. We'll create 2 there, 2 at the bottom, 2 at the top, and more than likely we'll come back and just readjust some of these points. And 2 down at the bottom, and then here what we'll do, just because this is the last one, I'm just going to draw something like that for now. Alright, so we need to reposition some of these so that they are in the right place to look a little better. Move these around a little bit. All right, and we got one more to go down here. Just push that over a little bit, and this one here we'll just pull over. All right, so we want to select all of those, and we want to pull it over to the middle of our rail. All right, and we want to drop that into the sweep NURB. And let's not forget to select the spline and change its intermediate points mode over to uniform. And we'll just take that count up to about, maybe 30 will be okay for this. I think that's enough. And we have all of the points selected. So let's just make sure that these points here are lined up with the top so that the hose is going through the little loop. That looks good. So we'll select all the points, and we'll use the points constraint. That will give us all the nulls for that. And what we want to do now is we want to group these nulls together at the top. That way the hose will actually rotate. So what we'll do is we'll start up here with the first one at the front. So what we want to do is select these 3 null objects and then hit Alt-G to group them into a master null. Now this master null will then be dropped as a child of the first end hook. So now we'll go over to the second one. We'll select these 2 null objects. We'll hit Alt-G to group them, and then that will go as a child of end 1. Now we'll do these 2 here. So we'll select them, group them, and drop that into the third one. And then for the last one, we'll select these 3 nulls, group them, and drop them as a child into the fourth one. So basically what we've done here is we have put them inside of a master null, and that master null is now in the little loop hook null. So when it rotates and turns, this will also rotate and turn, and now the hose will rotate and turn with it. All right, so before we get to the spring constraint, we need to clean up the hierarchy over here a little bit and reposition a few things. So what I want to do is I want to take these null targets as well as the sweep NURB, and I want to drag them down so that they are below these hook units, or these little loop hooks that we made, because those have the constraint tags on them, and I want those to be executed first. All right, so what we can do now is start working on the bottom. So what we want to do is just select the 2 nulls down here at the bottom, and then we want to group them. And we'll select these 2 here and group them as well. And the reason why we're grouping them is because if we only have 1 point down at the bottom, when this first unit up here starts to move back, before the distance constraint starts to work on this one to start pushing it, what's going to happen is the bottom of the hose here, it's going to kind of collapse in on itself, and it's not going to look right. So the only way to solve that is to add these multiple points. So what I want to do is I want to keep that loop down at the bottom. So in order to do that, we have to have these 2 points, and then we'll just group those into a master null. So now we can just do this last one. So we'll select those 2 and we'll group those together. All right, so now we can start applying the spring constraint. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to first select the master null down at the bottom. You don't want to select any of these up here at the top first, otherwise those nulls will be the one receiving the tag for the spring constraint. We only want to apply that tag to the one down here at the bottom. So with that selected, okay, there's the first one there. So we'll select that one. Then we will shift select that null shift select that one, and then we'll add the Spring Constraint. All right, so we'll do the same for this one. So we want to select that master null, shift select that one, shift select that one, and add the Spring Constraint. And then we'll do this one down here. So make sure you select the master null. You don't want to select either one of these two nulls. You just want to select the master null that they're grouped in. And then shift select this one and this one. And we'll add the tag to that. So it looks a little weird at the moment, and that's because we need to press play on the timeline. And there we go. So now if we start to move our rail, let's see what happens. All right, so that looks good. Let's see, do we have any intersecting right there? Nope, that looks pretty good. There is a little bit of a gap in there, so that turned out good. So now we just push them down the line. You can see that they are turning. You can see it turns with that loop hook, so that's good. And there we go. So that's pretty much how you create something like this with a hose attached to a railing system. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a hose. You can pretty much attach anything you want to and make it dynamic. I just thought a hose would be pretty cool for this. We'll watch it one more time. Everything looks pretty good. And just make sure that you have your timeline playing, because if you don't, what's going to happen is it will move, but as soon as you release it, it's going to stop. And the only way to update the viewport is to make sure you don't have anything selected, and then click and drag in the viewport, and that will actually update the viewport. But if you don't want to do that, just make sure that the timeline is playing. Now, if you don't like the way the hose is looking, maybe it's dangling too much or maybe not enough, what you can do is select the tag for the Spring Constraint, go into the Forces tab, and we can play around with some of these settings. So the one that I usually like to adjust would be the mass. So if you increase this, it's going to make the hose heavier and it's going to make it sag down further. Or if you take it down, it will make the hose not as heavy. So I usually keep it at a value of about 10. That works pretty good. All right, so I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this tutorial. I think this pretty much concludes everything that I wanted to go over in this part. I'm pretty sure that later on in another part, we'll talk about the Spring Constraint some more, and we'll go over some more of these little properties over here, like the attractor. I have an idea that I'd like to do for that, so we'll do that in another future tutorial. So as always, guys, thank you for watching. I hope that this tutorial on this little dynamic railing system has been helpful. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to comment below. And as always, guys, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next tutorial.